It was the kind of summer that made the wheat fields shimmer like gold. In June of 1968, the Doyle family gathered, as they did every year at the old farmhouse near Elwood, Kansas. The house belonged to Thomas and Beatrice Doyle, proud grandparents of 6, who lived on the same land that had been in the family for over a century. It was a sprawling property, 40 acres of flat farmland with a dusty red barn, a collapsed chicken coop, and the centerpiece, a 3-story Victorian home that's still like a relic from another time. That year, the Doyle cousins were all under 12, and their favorite game was hide and seek. The house was perfect for it. It had creaky staircases, forgotten storage rooms, and doors that led to nowhere. Most of the younger children were too nervous to venture past the second floor. Not Margaret. Margaret Ellen Doyle was 9. She had dark auburn hair that curled wildly when it rained and a laugh that echoed down hallways. She was curious. Too curious, her mother always said, and brave enough to crawl under beds, behind wardrobes, or even into the disused dumbwaiter that terrified the others. On that afternoon, the sun was blazing overhead. Beatrice had just brought out lemonade and slices of watermelon for the children. The cousins scattered into the house, counting loudly. Margaret was last to join the round. Her mother, and remembered seeing her dash through the back door barefoot, with her small leather shoes in her hand. She hated wearing them but was told to keep them nearby. She smiled, then disappeared inside. When they realized Margaret hadn't come out after the game, they laughed at first. "She's just hiding too well," said Tommy, her older cousin. They searched the house from top to bottom, calling her name, checking every nook they could think of. Minutes turned to hours. The laughter gave way to nervous silence. By sunset, and was in tears. Thomas called the sheriff. Flashlights swept across the fields and into the woods. Men walked shoulder to shoulder across the farmland. The barn was emptied. The attic searched. Even the old root cellar was opened. Nothing. No footprints. No sign of struggle. No sound. The house, with its peeling wallpaper and crooked floorboards, seemed to hold its breath. Deputies and volunteers came from nearby towns over the next few days. K-9 units sniffed through the house and surrounding woods. Nothing turned up, not even the small leather shoes. Over the following weeks, theories formed and faded. Some thought she had run away. Others blamed strangers passing on the nearby highway. But no one could explain how a child could vanish so completely from a house full of people and stay behind long after the others left. She refused to leave the farmhouse. She walked the halls at night, whispering her daughter's name, listening, waiting. Thomas eventually boarded up the dumbwaiter shaft. Beatrice covered the mirrors. By late August, the house was silent again. In time, the farmland was leased out. The Doyles stopped coming. By the early 80s, the house was empty, the windows broken, the paint flaking in long gray curls. Kids from town said it was haunted. They dared each other go inside and listen for Margaret's footsteps, still hiding, still waiting. The case was never closed. Year after year, the same file sat untouched in the Elwood Sheriff's Office. A missing person. No leads. No remains. Nothing to bury. Just a photograph in a floral dress, and a pair of tiny shoes no one could ever find. Decades passed. The house sagged. The floorboards bowed inward. Ivy overtook the porch columns. By the time a property developer acquired the land in 2023, most people had forgotten the name Margaret Ellen Doyle. But the house hadn't. It stood patiently through 5.5 decades of Kansas storms and silence. It had secrets buried in the dust, under the beams, behind the walls. Secrets no one had thought to look for, not until the new owners arrived. The couple who bought the Doyle farmhouse weren't from Kansas. Matthew and Rachel Carter had been living in Denver when they saw the listing. Rachel had always wanted to renovate an old country home, and Matthew loved the idea of turning it into a vacation rental. They didn't know anything about the Doyle family or what had happened in that house. On their second day inside, Rachel found a faded photo wedged behind a mirror on the second floor. It showed a girl, around 9, standing barefoot on the farmhouse steps. Her hair was wild, her smile full of life. On the back, written in pencil, Margaret, June 68. Rachel didn't think much of it. Old homes always came with stories. But later, as she sat alone in the dusty attic, surrounded by boxes full of rotting books and yellowed newspaper clippings, she found herself staring at the floorboards. Something about the way they curved. The wood was old, but not original. It had been replaced at some point, and not professionally. There were uneven seams. A few of the nails didn't match. That night, when Matthew came up to help her clear out the attic, she mentioned it. They decided to pry up one section, just to see. They didn't know they were about to find something that hadn't seen daylight in 55 years. A discovery that would reopen a case everyone had given up on. A pair of shoes, impossibly small, nestled in darkness. The plank came up with a groan, reluctant after decades of silence. Beneath it was a shallow cavity packed with brittle insulation and layers of dust so thick they looked like ash. Rachel reached in first. Her hand disappeared into the darkness as Matthew held the flashlight steady. For a moment there was nothing, just a feel of splintered wood, dried nails, and bits of crumbling paper. Then her fingers brushed against something softer, worn, curved like a heel. She pulled out slowly. It was a child's shoe, leather, cracked and discolored by time. The stitching was hand-done, and the small brass buckle still clung to one side. Rachel turned it over. There was no sole left, just a threadbare impression of what once had been. A second shoe followed, matching. The two were tucked beside each other, as if someone had taken them off deliberately and placed them there. Neither Rachel nor Matthew said a word for a long moment. The attic around them felt colder now, more alert. "Do you think these belong to that girl?" Rachel finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Matthew nodded slowly. "Could be. It matches the year. And the size." They didn't sleep well that night. The house had already felt eerie, but now it carried something heavier, like a presence had been reawakened. In the morning, Rachel contacted the local historical society, not expecting much. But by the end of the day, 2 people from Elwood had driven out to property with yellowed newspaper clippings, and a name neither Carter had heard before, Margaret Ellen Doyle. One of the women, a local teacher named Helen, had gone to school with Margaret's cousins. She remembered the search, the posters, the silence that followed. She remembered how the town stopped talking about it after a while, as if forced to let it go. Helen looked at the shoes in silence. Then she said, with a finality that sent chills through the room, "Those are hers." When the sheriff's office was contacted, they reopened the case in name only. There were no remains, no physical evidence beyond the shoes. But a forensic team arrived within the week to scan the structure. Drones and infrared tools mapped out the old house from basement to attic, uncovering subtle architectural inconsistencies. One in particular stood out, a long-forgotten service tunnel that once ran from the attic to basement, likely for maintenance and wiring during the house's early days. According to historical blueprints, the passage had been sealed off during renovations in the early 1950s. No current entrance existed, but the scan showed a void behind the east attic wall, a cavity roughly 3 feet wide and 4 feet deep, wedged between joists. It was connected faintly to the remains of the service tunnel. Dust and decay had collapsed parts of it long ago, making it invisible from above or below. No one could say how a child would have found her way inside. Rachel stood near the attic window as the team drilled small holes into the wall to run scopes inside. She didn't want to look, but she listened, heart racing, as muffled voices confirmed the space existed, and that it was too small for an adult to enter without removing significant parts of the structure. They did not find bones. They did not find clothing, but they did find scratches along the interior wall. Faint, irregular, low to the ground. And one more thing, a button, pearl-colored, just barely intact. It had likely come from a dress. For Rachel and Matthew, the house had transformed. No longer just a fixer-upper, it was now a monument to something that had remained unseen for more than half a century. They halted renovations. The attic was sealed again, this time carefully, respectfully. And then Rachel started asking questions. She tracked down Margaret's surviving relatives, some still in Kansas, others scattered across the country. Most hadn't spoken about the disappearance in decades. A few hung up immediately, but one, Margaret's cousin Tommy, agreed to speak with her. He was 66 now, living alone in Topeka. He remembered that summer like it had just passed. The watermelon, the lemonade, the way Margaret had smiled before running into the house barefoot, carrying those shoes. She always played too hard, he told Rachel. Wanted to win everything. I think she found a spot none of us ever knew about. Tommy's voice broke. I didn't even look upstairs. We thought she ran outside. Rachel asked him what he thought happened. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I think she got stuck. I think she hid somewhere she couldn't get out of, and we never heard her. Or maybe we did, but we didn't understand what it was. I remember hearing something, once, a tapping. We thought it was pipes. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. The wind whistled through the cracks in the window panes. The air in the attic seemed to pulse. She dreamed of a girl sitting barefoot on the attic floor, her shoes beside her. She was smiling. Then the dream shifted. The girl was knocking on wood, again and again, and no one came. The next day, Rachel found a dusty scrapbook in the basement, hidden inside a cedar trunk. It belonged to Beatrice Doyle. Inside were photographs, recipes, newspaper clippings, and one page of the child's handwriting. It read, If I hide real good, no one will find me. It was signed, simply Margaret. Rachel cried when she read it, and somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. After the discovery in the attic, the Doyle farmhouse no longer felt like a renovation project. It felt like a question still waiting to be answered. Rachel began spending more time in the house alone. While Matthew handled logistics with contractors and county inspectors, she explored the room slowly, deliberately, following the echoes of a little girl who had once played there. She stopped using power tools. She stopped playing music while she worked. Instead, she listened to the creaks in the floor, the groans in the walls, the peculiar stillness that settled after dusk. And then came the knocking. It started faintly, a soft tapping sound. Late at night, always from the same corner of the second floor, beneath the stairwell that led to the attic. Rachel first thought it was the old plumbing, or perhaps rodents in the walls. But pest control found nothing. The pipes had long been sealed. The sound wasn't random. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Matthew didn't believe it at first. But one night, he stayed up with Rachel and heard it himself. 3 slow knocks, followed by silence. Then, after several minutes, 2 more. The sound stopped the moment either of them got close. They recorded it once. When they played the audio back, the knocks were clearer than they had been in the moment, sharp and oddly hollow, like someone tapping from behind wood. Rachel sent the audio to a sound technician in Denver. He said the resonance suggested the tapping came from within a confined wooden space, possibly a crawl space or a sealed chamber. It only deepened the mystery. Rachel returned to the attic, this time with a detailed floor plan of the house. She traced every possible line from the attic to the basement. Most paths were blocked or rotted through. But there was one area no one had yet opened, a section of the floor behind the old water heater in the basement, covered in poured concrete, likely during the renovations of the 50s. If the original passage between the attic and basement had ever been functional, it might have ended there. With the county's permission, a crew was brought in to scan the concrete. Underneath, they found what appeared to be a brick-lined cavity, collapsed, sealed, and filled with rubble. It was impossible to excavate fully without compromising the foundation. The team recommended against continuing. Rachel stood in the basement that afternoon, staring at the blocked cavity, the brick edges barely visible beneath years of concrete and dust. She imagined a passage once alive with purpose, an old maintenance corridor, forgotten by time and memory. But to Margaret, it would have seemed magical, a secret place, a perfect hiding spot. A few days later, Rachel received a package from Tommy Doyle. Inside were 2 items wrapped in tissue paper: a school photo of Margaret taken just weeks before her disappearance, and a yellowed, hand-drawn map of the farmhouse that the children had used during their hide-and-seek games. It was playful and crude, filled with misspelled labels and drawn-in ghosts, but one section stood out. In the top corner near the attic stairs was a small X. Next to it, in a child's looping cursive, were the words, "Secret Tunnel Rachel traced her finger over the spot. It aligned almost perfectly with the section where the shoes had been found. She pressed a photo of Margaret beside the map. There was something painfully vibrant about her smile, frozen in time. It was the face of a girl who had no idea what was coming, who only wanted to play a game and win. A few nights later, while organizing old tools in the barn, Rachel found something else. It was a long-forgotten toolbox, rusted shut, buried beneath rotted wood. Inside were tools that hadn't seen daylight in half a century. But tucked underneath the hammers and wrenches was a small journal. The name etched on the front was Thomas Doyle, Margaret's grandfather. The entries were sparse, written in pencil and dated throughout the 1950s. Most were short notes about repairs, pipes bursting, electrical lines sparking, winter drafts. But near the end of the journal, one line stood out. Passage sealed this week. Too dangerous for children. Told Beatrice not to mention it. Rachel's breath caught. She flipped the page. Nothing followed. That was the final entry. So Thomas had known. He'd sealed the tunnel himself. Had Margaret found a way in any way? Had she slipped through a loose plank or an unfinished seal? Had she become trapped behind the very wall her grandfather tried to hide? The pieces were forming a shape. Not a complete picture, but enough to understand. Rachel returned to the attic one last time. She brought Margaret's shoes with her, carefully wrapped in cloth. She placed them gently where they'd been found, side by side, just as they had rested for over 5 decades. Then she sat on the floor and whispered, "We see you now." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. But inside, the house was still. Quiet, at peace, if only for a moment. The next morning, Rachel began writing a letter, not to a relative or a historian or even a sheriff, but to Margaret, a girl she never knew, whose life had flickered out in silence, buried between beams and forgotten drafts. She wrote, "You were never truly lost, just hidden, and now, finally, someone found you." But the story wasn't finished. Not yet, because just when Rachel thought she understood everything, Matthew uncovered something else. Something tucked deep behind a crawl space in the barn wall, sealed with a rusted hinge, a small wooden box. And inside it, wrapped in cloth and old newspaper, was a photograph none of them had seen before. Margaret, in the attic, barefoot, smiling, and beside her, barely visible in the shadows behind a loose plank, something else, a figure, not quite adult, not quite child, watching. Rachel stared at the photograph for a long time before saying a word. It was slightly curled from time, the corners soft, the surface fogged by dust. But even through the haze, Margaret's face shone brightly. She stood with her arms folded behind her back, her chin tilted upward, her smile full of mischief. It was unmistakably the attic. Same angled ceiling, same cracked wallpaper behind her. Her shoes sat beside her feet. But it was what stood in the background that made Rachel's breath catch. Barely visible in the shadows behind a loose panel was a figure. Its outline was faint, as if it had been caught mid-movement, frozen in a moment it hadn't meant to be captured. It looked like a child, thin, slightly hunched, possibly wearing overalls. But the head was turned, obscured. The image was too blurred to be certain. Still, it was undeniably there, just behind Margaret. Rachel handed the photo to Matthew. "That's not one of the cousins," she whispered. Matthew didn't answer right away. He was too focused, squinting into the grain of the image. Then he said, slowly, "There were rumors, remember? About the house. Stories." Rachel nodded. "About tunnels, secrets, ghosts." But what if it wasn't just stories? They took the photo to Helen, the retired schoolteacher who had helped them connect the shoes to Margaret. Her hands trembled as she held the photograph. "This was taken up there?" she asked. Rachel nodded. Helen stared at the background figure. "That's not Margaret's cousin. I can promise you that." Then she paused, lips tightening. "There was a boy, lived on the edge of the property. His family worked for the Doyles in the 40s. His name was Silas. Silas Reed." Rachel and Matthew listened quietly as Helen recounted what little she remembered. Silas had been a quiet child, older than Margaret by at least 10 years, but still living on the property when the Doyles took over the land. His family worked the fields, lived in a small house near the orchard that had since collapsed. He wasn't well, Helen said delicately. He didn't speak much, spent his time alone, always wandering the barns, the basements, the crawl spaces. Then one day he was just gone. Gone how? Matthew asked. No one knows. His parents said he ran away. But the whispers back then, they said the Doyles found him somewhere he shouldn't have been. Something about the tunnel. Then suddenly, the whole thing was sealed up, quietly, quickly. Rachel thought of the journal, told Beatrice not to mention it. Do you think Margaret met him? Rachel asked, in the attic? Helen looked back at the photo. Maybe, or maybe she just found where he had been. That boy knew this house better than anyone. If anyone could have left something behind, it was Silas. Rachel felt the house watching her now. Not menacing, but alert, like it remembered. She asked Helen if there was anyone left from Silas's family. Not around here, she said, but I'll ask. Later that evening, Rachel and Matthew returned to the attic. They brought the photograph and placed it near where Margaret had once stood. The figure in the shadows seemed to fit the space too perfectly, like it had been waiting to be acknowledged. Matthew shone a flashlight between the floorboards where the shoes had been found. For the first time, they noticed something else. Scratched into the underside of the plank was a single word. Here. Rachel leaned closer. It wasn't carved with a tool. It looked as if it had been scratched by a small nail or even a fingernail. The letters were shallow but frantic. She sat back on her heels, overwhelmed. I think Margaret got in, she said, and I think Silas either found her or she found where he used to hide. Matthew turned off the flashlight. The attic fell into twilight. Rachel stood and looked around. There's more, she said. We just haven't seen it yet. That night, Rachel dreamed again. She saw the house as it was in 1968, bright, full of laughter, the air thick with dust motes and summer heat. She followed Margaret through the halls, down the stairs, up again, then through the attic door. The girl moved quickly, confidently, like she knew exactly where to go. Rachel called after her, but Margaret didn't turn. She slipped behind a wall panel and vanished, and Rachel woke with a start, breath shallow, her skin cold. The next day, Rachel and Matthew began a new search, not for evidence, but for spaces, hollow places behind walls, false corners. Old diagrams from city records suggested the house had been modified multiple times since the early 1900s. Many of those modifications were unpermitted, undocumented. They started with a barn, where the photograph had been hidden. Behind a row of shelving, they found an access panel screwed shut with strip bolts. Inside was a narrow crawl space filled with dust and fragments of old wood. And tucked between two beams, as if slipped through from above, was a small cloth bag. Inside, a brass thimble, a length of faded ribbon, and a tiny wooden horse. Whittled crudely by hand, its legs uneven. They didn't recognize the items, but they felt unmistakably like a child's treasures, left there for safekeeping, or for someone to find. Rachel brought them to Helen. The moment she saw the horse, her eyes filled with tears. Silas carved those, she said softly. He used to leave them around the orchard, like little messages. Rachel asked if Margaret might have found one. If she did, Helen said, maybe she followed them. Maybe she thought it was part of the game. And maybe she was right. Rachel and Matthew returned to the attic, where they found a second carved message deep in the paneling behind the insulation. Too late. The letters were jagged, hurried. Rachel sat in silence for a long time. It was as if Margaret had found the tunnel, had entered it willingly, maybe even with hope. But whatever happened inside, whatever she saw or felt, had changed. She'd tried to get out, but no one heard her. Until now. And still, something felt unfinished. Rachel had come to believe Margaret was trying to be found. But now she wondered, was Silas trying to be remembered too? Because that photograph in the attic wasn't the only one. There was another they would soon discover. One buried not in the house, but beneath a tree where the orchard used to be. The orchard had long since faded into overgrowth. What once were orderly rows of apple and plum trees were now a wild tangle of branches, weeds, and thorny vines. The trunks still stood in crooked lines, many of them gnarled and hollow, their bark gray with age. No fruit had grown here in decades, yet the air carried a subtle sweetness, as if the trees still remembered what they were. Rachel wandered through the brush, stepping over sunken roots and crumbling fence posts. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, only that something was pulling her forward. Matthew followed, holding a faded map Rachel had found in Beatrice Doyle's scrapbook. It wasn't labeled, but it showed the layout of the orchard as it had been in the early 1950s. A red circle had been drawn around one tree near the far edge of the property. No name, no explanation. They reached it by late afternoon. The tree was massive, older than the others. Its trunk split near the base, forming a dark hollow. Vines curled up its side like veins. It looked almost human, twisted in pain or perhaps warning. Inside the hollow, Rachel saw something glinting. She reached in and pulled out a rusted tin container, the kind used to hold cookies or sewing supplies. It was sealed with string, the lid dented but intact. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside were several small items, each wrapped in wax paper: a child's marble, a cracked bottle cap, and, folded neatly beneath them, a single black and white photograph. Rachel unwrapped it slowly. The image was clearer than the attic photo. It showed the same room, the attic unmistakable. But this time, Margaret was not alone. She sat cross-legged on the floor, holding something in her lap. Her expression was unreadable. Calm, maybe, or stunned. Beside her, sitting just inside the shadows, was the boy, Silas. His face was clearer now. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't menacing. He looked distant, like he wasn't fully present. His eyes were downcast. One hand rested on the floor. The other reached out toward Margaret, but didn't quite touch her. Rachel stared at the photo until her eyes burned. Matthew gently took it from her. This was never just about her. Rachel nodded. He was there. Maybe not when she got trapped, but at some point he came back. They gave the photo to the Historical Society for safekeeping, but not before scanning it and uploading it to a digital archive. Within a week, messages came pouring in. People who remembered Silas, who had vague memories of seeing him around town, always alone. Some recalled him staring at the school playground through the fence. Others swore they'd seen him walking near the farmhouse long after he supposedly vanished. But there were no records, no death certificate, no missing persons report. It was as if Silas had never existed on paper, only in memory. Helen contacted Rachel a few days later. She'd found someone, an older woman in Nebraska, who had once lived with the Reed family as a teenager. Her name was Lydia. She remembered Silas vividly. He was kind, she said, but different. He didn't talk, not because he couldn't. He just didn't know how to be around people. Lydia confirmed something else. When the Doyles sealed up the tunnel, Silas changed. He became afraid of the house. He stopped going near it. And then one day, his family packed up and left. They said it was time. Rachel asked if she thought Silas had ever come back. Lydia was quiet for a long moment. I think part of him never left. Back at the farmhouse, Rachel and Matthew decided to leave one part of the attic untouched. They framed Margaret's shoes in a glass case and placed them on a shelf beside a candle and a printed copy of the attic photograph. The crawl space was resealed, but not hidden. It became a quiet corner of the house, a space not for tourists, but for remembrance. They opened the house to visitors later that fall, not as a vacation rental, but as a historical site. Locals came with stories. Some brought objects from the Doyle farm's heyday. Others came just to walk the orchard or stand in the attic and feel the silence for themselves. One man in his 70s stood in the attic for over an hour without speaking. When Rachel finally approached him, he said, "My brother disappeared in '54. We thought he ran away, but he always talked about a tunnel. I wonder now." He left without saying more. The orchard grew quiet again that winter, the trees coated in frost. But the energy in the house had changed. It no longer felt heavy or waiting. It felt seen. Rachel kept the second photo close. Sometimes late at night, she'd study it, focusing not on Margaret, but on Silas. His posture, the direction of his gaze, the space between him and the girl beside him. And she'd wonder, had he been trying to help? Had he led her into that passage? Or found her once she was already there? Had he been too late to save her? Or had he simply stayed because, like Margaret, he didn't want to be forgotten? In early spring, while repairing a rotted beam near the back of the barn, Matthew found one final object, a small wooden carving tucked between two boards. It was a horse, just like the one from the cloth bag, but this one was different. It had two figures riding it, one slightly larger than the other, and carved into the base was a single word: together. Rachel held it in her hands for a long time. She placed it beside Margaret's shoes in the attic. A quiet gesture, a closing of a circle. 55 years after Margaret disappeared, the house no longer kept secrets. It told a story of a girl who wanted to win a game, of a boy who knew how to hide, and of the silent places where their lives crossed in a moment no one saw. Not until now. And as the sun filtered through the attic windows that spring morning, dust danced in the light, and somewhere deep beneath the floorboards, the house seemed finally still.